Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do a video on a whole group of videos that were sent to me this weekend. Rebel Wisdom did a thing with Paul Kingsnorth on pagan to Christian, which was very interesting. I don't know if I'll have time this afternoon to get them all in. Hopefully, if I don't, I'll pick up this all tomorrow in a part two. So that's definitely something you want to watch. Pagan to Christian, Paul Kingsnorth, where he's riffing basically off of his First Things piece, The Cross and the Machine, which if you only have time for one, read The Cross and the Machine because he's better writing than he is speaking, which isn't, a terribly exceptional thing to say of an author. It's his job. Gavin Ashenden, who made a video a while ago about Jordan Peterson, got a lot of views, got a lot of attention. Very interesting guy. He was on The Meaning Code. I'm going to play some of that. He just released a video. Apparently, Jordan Peterson, when he was in Cambridge, had face-to-face with Ashenden and a few other theologians. And some of the reporting from that was quite interesting. Karen sent that to me. And Mark Lefevre sent to me this video with John Verveiki talking to Rick Rapetti, which was very interesting. And I know it might trigger a bunch of you, but hear me out on some of this stuff. So I want to begin with this video, and I want to first note that when it comes to mystical experiences, worldview presuppositions are a big deal. Let me say it that way. Let's begin. This is really a remarkable conversation. I see why John was very excited about it. So let's just jump in because John sort of does what I usually do in terms of getting a lot of his background, and John is promising more conversations with him, which makes perfect sense since this guy is a professor of philosophy and this guy had wanted to study cognosci at some point, but there wasn't. Anyway, so the whole video was quite interesting. But let's begin with his personal story.
Just, this is part of the who is Rick Rapetti and how did he get here and what's it all about. I think I might have mentioned when I was 15, I accidentally I was flipping through channels on a TV, which we did this way back then.
Yes, I remember. I remember, Rick.
And I saw two beautiful women in leotards doing these sensual movements, and a 15-year-old boy, it was my libido that caught my attention. Salience. It was in my salience landscape. I stopped that channel, but I realized it was an exercise class. So I used to watch. Jack LaLanne had an exercise class that I used to do, and so I said, "Let me try this. I've never heard of this or whatever." It was a yoga class, and at the end of it, the teacher, his name was Richard Hittleman, which is a kind of Anglo kind of name, but he looked like Chinese or something. And the two women in leotards were European descent. But at the end, he had us in deep relaxation on our backs. And I had an out-of-body experience.
Oh.
That's how ripe I was for this.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I what happened was I felt like all this energy collecting in my head, and then my head felt like it was expanding and my body was shrinking, and then my body felt huge and my head felt tiny, and that went back and forth a few times, and then I popped right out of my body, like a gaseous, spacious awareness over my head, looking down from the ceiling in my room.
Wow.
And I felt like it was a Gnostic kind of thing. I felt like there's this other world. All that stuff that people say is true. Like I really, like in an instant, I had this flash of, it felt like a memory, like this is real.
Yeah.
Like there's something going on here. And then I thought maybe I'm dead, and I got frightened, and I didn't know if I could get back into my body, and I shrunk right back into my body.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked a fair amount about psychedelics in the last little while, and my part of my point with this, I'm going to make some more points as I get into a few more videos. Part of my point is skeptical materialism is about the most fragile worldview you can imagine. Because this guy, he's a 15-year-old kid. He's flipping through the channel, sees two hot girls doing yoga, and there's a yoga teacher, and so he, how many guys start going to church because a hot girl is going to church, and this guy's flipping through the channels and there's two attractive women in leotards and he's 15. And so he starts watching and he gets into this and bang, he has an experience. This stuff is not that uncommon. Now, maybe it didn't happen to you, or maybe it did. And maybe it did happen to you, but it's something that you've never put into words or never articulated. This kind of thing happens. It's not that uncommon. And part of the argument that a lot of people have been making about psychedelics is that, well, you can use this to sort of pop people out of their skeptical materialist frame and have them have an experience of something else. Okay, it might very well do that. Now his story continues and he goes in a lot deeper. And before I get further into his story, I want to get into another story to make part of my point about worldview. Okay, this is from the Meaning Code channel, and those of you who are very familiar with my channel know Karen and the Meaning Code channel. She's her channel sort of started after mine. She she found me after I was doing Jordan Peterson videos. She was into Jordan Peterson. She's a Christian. She's an artist. She's usually got one of her major pieces of artwork behind her head, as she did after Gavin Ashenden did his video that sort of went viral about Jordan Peterson. Karen's a lot better than I am about tracking people down and doing an interview, but one of the things I really appreciate about Karen's channel is that she will usually pay attention to some of the same people I pay attention to, and then she'll go through and do the work of getting people's biographies in a little bit more detailed state than usually what passes on internet conversations, where it's it's your CV, basically, it's your resume or something, but goes a little bit deeper into his story because he's really got an extremely interesting story, and this is where it begins.
I mean, if we were doing this properly, I'd have to talk about my parents, and I had an immensely strong mother and a gentler but clever father. I had a difficult childhood. I remember having existential angst as a child, looking up into the sky, lying down in the summer, thinking, "What on earth am I doing as a child perched on the skin of this planet? Who am I? What am I supposed to do? Why am I here?" I'm quite a slow developer, but I think I got a touch of adolescent angst early. I've always been completely bewildered by the fact that for most of time and space, we're not. Then we have this brief flaring up of consciousness and moral opportunity and responsibility, and then apparently we're not again. And this either has to make you a nihilist or a believer. But like most people, I was quite lazy with the business of belief. I was sent away to a cathedral school at Canterbury, so my school was built around Canterbury Cathedral, which I think had a very powerful effect on me architecturally. I was intrigued by Thomas à Becket and aware, really, in my early teens, I think in not too romantic way, that the cost of taking on the state in the name of a higher ethical value might be fatal. And as an adolescent, I lived 1 year as an atheist and the other year as a Christian. So for about 12 to 18, I flipped each year to see what the consequences were like of these two lifestyles. And but I had a fairly confused journey. I left college, high school at 18 and went to North America for 9 months, where I earned my living as an itinerant music teacher. And I think during that period, the thing that happened that was enormously significant was I drunk myself to death. So people will say, well, that sounds a bit hyperbolic, and what on earth do you mean by that? And I drank a liter of vodka. As a university chaplain, I presided over the funerals of kids who had drunk themselves to death on far less than a liter of spirits.
What year was that?
What happened to me?
What year?
That was That would have been 1973, in the autumn, September 1973.
I did that in 1965.
Good grief.
Yeah, it wasn't vodka though. It was sloe gin. But
oh,
I love how Karen starts comparing notes on their most near fatal drinking episode.
not much
been
difference.
worse because getting all the sugar, you know, yeah.
Yeah.
And I was dead to the world for like, I don't know, 14 hours. I mean, it was, yeah, it's bad.
Well, something
Nobody
strange
else has
happened
ever
to
heard
me.
that, by the way. I've never heard it.
You can
Now it's on my channel too.
cut it out if you decide you've disclosed too much. But something strange happened with me. I left my body and I floated above my body. At the time, I had no idea how common this is. I mean, this is just a common or garden near-death experience. And one of the things I discovered when I began to read psychology.
Okay, so, obviously, the interview on Voices with Verveiki wasn't a near-death experience. But again, these kinds of out-of-body experiences, and this guy drinks himself to death and he almost gets there. And
a bit more professionally was that, there's an enormous amount of this kind of thing. Alistair Hart.
And to go to the Marascu video that Jordan Peterson, and the after school video that I did on that, you have to learn to die first. So here they are. I mean, people have experiences like this very regularly.
Hardy, a zoologist who had the chair at Oxford that Dawkins now occupies, had such strange experiences in the First World War. He set up an institute precisely to gather together the kind of information of spiritual experiences that people had, only to discover that the volume and enormity of them is huge. So one of the questions comes, why don't we have permission to talk about them in European society in the 20th century? But that's another conversation. I left my...
And that would be a good conversation, because I think that is not a small thing. Why don't we have permission to talk about these things? And as a pastor, I talk to people all the time, and people say things to their pastor that they won't say out in public because they know they'll lose status if they talk about some out-of-body experience or a mystical experience. But I have a friend who was not a Christian at all. His parents weren't Christian. He was laying in bed one day, and suddenly this something comes upon him. And it's just this being of love and light and power, and says, "Now do you believe in me?" And now this, I think part of the reason people don't want to talk about this is because it offends our democratic sensibilities. And again, as a Calvinist, I deal with this all the time. Because, we all should be equidistant from God. Well, we're not. We all should have exactly the same package of experience. How on earth could you make such a claim when you know human society? None of us have an equal packet of experience. Some of us have great parents. Some of us have terrible parents. Some of us had our parents abandon us. I was talking to someone who was the father of a homeless person who was checking up on his son. And he told me, he said, it was during the Great Depression. This guy's now well in his 90s. He said, my mother died when I was 6, and my father abandoned me, and someone else in the town had to take me in. These stories are not uncommon. I mean, to imagine that somehow we all are given this equal shot at some standard good life. No. To imagine that we all have sort of, regular spiritual sensitivities. No. A world of things goes into people's worldview creation. I've mentioned many times, you listen to Jordan Peterson, he's the kind of guy that has visions. Many people have visions. This is not uncommon at all. Sometimes they're near-death experiences. These two drank themselves dead. Sometimes it's, and that interestingly enough, again, with the psychedelics was kind of the point of Marascu's book. First, you have to learn to die. Well, if you're 16 years old and you drink that liter of vodka and your body, you feel yourself leave your body, well, tends to make an impression, but it won't necessarily make the kind of impression you think it should make.
My body, and I went to judgment. I thought I went to judgment. I experienced a very bright light, only it wasn't the object light, it was the source of all light. And what lay behind the light was both loving and stern, and it was singular and plural. And I realized I was going to be judged. And I remember thinking, if I get sent to hell, I will know there is justice at the universe, and that will be of some comfort to me.
Now, what's interesting is that right away people will hear this story and say, well, he was raised in the UK and, there was Christian mythology behind it. And so Christian mythology figured into it. Oh, okay. But suddenly when you're having a psychedelic experience, then suddenly it's just, well, it's completely apart from your metaphysical, psychological presuppositions. And again, if you've read, near-death experience books, or psychedelic, people's experiences vary enormously with these kinds of things.
Hell. And then the courts of heaven retired. I heard a verse which I now know is in the book of Revelation, but I'm sure I'd heard it as a child, but I didn't know I knew it. There was silence in heaven for half an hour. And then the courts of heaven came back and I was pronounced forgiven and sent back. Now this is where it becomes interesting. I went back into my body.
This is where it becomes interesting. I was interested before.
At dawn. And normally the reason I think this actually happened rather than is some form of electrical misfiring of the neurons in the brain or some kind of unconscious rationalization taking place in the moment of trauma or possibilities, is because I felt so well. Normally, I don't drink alcohol very well. It poisons me. I can't manage it. And I would have been, if I had just had a few pints or even several double gins, I would have been, my bowels would have suffered for a few days. And there's no way that having drunk a liter of vodka, I could have emerged, it being anything but very ill for a while. But I was absolutely not just well, but super well. And I felt enormously, I thought, well, this is forgiveness. I must keep this forgiveness. How do I do that? One of the reasons I drank so much was because I tried to beat up our boss the night before because he'd been stealing our money. And so the students who had been with me as on part of this government program music camp deputed me to go and get the money from him. And my arguments didn't work. And I ended up by shaking him by the lapels and lifting him off the floor and banging him against the wall until he agreed to give it back. It didn't do him any good, although he gave the money back, but it did me a lot of harm, and I went away to drink as a result. So when I came back, I thought, well, I have to go
and again, if you ask the very interesting question, well, what was harmed? Wasn't that why he went? Shouldn't he feel a success? Something inside of him was harmed by the violence he did to this man. Now, you might argue whether or not the violence was justified because the man was doing harm to him and his co-workers, but that's not a small thing, that something inside of him was harmed.
Forgive him, and then there was a kind of Laurel and Hardy-esque moment when I began to chase him around the compound in order to catch him, in order to forgive him. And it took some persuading for him that I was chasing him to forgive him and not to continue the episode of last night. But joking aside, I was sure I'd met God, and I wondered what on earth I should do to keep this extraordinary experience of well-being and forgiveness and belonging
Another story. A woman once told me, by the time she told me, she was a very old woman indeed. She had not an easy childhood. She was in a marriage that was violent. She was regularly beat up by her spouse. All of that, she'd gotten out of the marriage and gotten her life in order and was in a place of peace and security quite a few years later. But it was always kind of concerned about this idea of the fear of the Lord. Why should we be afraid of God? A lot of people are concerned about that idea. And she too was in her bed alone one night, and a pressure comes down on her and kind of pins her to the bed. And she wonders, what is this? And then she doesn't feel threatened by it, but she feels its weight. And so then she hears, I don't know if it was inside her head or she heard it audibly, and the question was, do you fear me? Are you afraid? And she said no. And then it was done. So again, these kinds of things are not unusual. And, it wasn't a psychedelic for Gavin Ashenden. It was a liter of alcohol because he had hurt himself internally. There had been a moral wound inside of him for getting his money back from this guy who was stealing from these young men.
Authentication from having been loved and given another chance. The trouble was that a woman then offered to be my girlfriend, and that at the age of 18, that kind of wiped everything else out. Until a couple of years later, I was faced a dreadful crisis. And
anyway, the whole story is amazing, so I'll put the link to this video down below. Okay, let's go back to the Verveiki Rick Rapetti video.
Right.
So like that blew my mind. I hadn't been reading about anything with yoga or meditation, nothing. It just happened to me. So, like an Old Testament prophet or something,
Yeah.
I got zapped by something bigger than myself.
Wow.
I went out and got my hands on everything I could on yoga and meditation in the local library, flipping through the stacks and whatnot, and started teaching myself yoga and meditation. Within a matter of months, I found a woman who had lived in India for 15 or 25 years, I forget the number, who had a meditation group in Manhattan in the basement of a church in Greenwich Village. One of my friends who saw me walking around carrying Be Here Now all the time said, "Oh, you're into that? Our friend Patty has a meditation teacher." And I was like, "Patty?" I was there. And when I walked in, I felt like I knew those people. It was like my lost tribe or something. It was just this phenomenal feeling of connection,
Right.
like a Sangha feeling. And I was hooked lock, stock, and barrel once I met the teacher. She was just a very powerful individual. She was like an English woman, but she wore a sari all the time after living in India for decades. And I started having one mystical experience after another.
Wow.
And I was meditating. I became like an overnight serious yogi. I became celibate, vegetarian. I quit smoking, drinking, everything. I was meditating hours a day, doing yoga every day. I did this for years. And
I mean, he did it hardcore. Most of the people that I know, they dabble. This guy clearly, took it all the way.
I had nothing but mystical experiences, precognitive experiences, you name it, all kinds of stuff that I couldn't understand. That's what led me to philosophy. One of my experiences in meditation was this feeling like almost omniscient, like I was in this realm of Plato's forms.
Right.
This was this vast space of intelligibility, to use a phrase that you use a lot. And it was like beyond conception, and yet it was filled with understanding.
Yes.
It was the weirdest thing.
Yes.
And I remember coming out of it and thinking, that's real. That's more real than this.
Yes.
I can't verbalize that,
Yes.
but I need to study philosophy and linguistics and things like that in order to be able to try to even understand and communicate that and improve my, relationship with that. And that's what directed me to philosophy.
Okay, what's very interesting here is that you're going to see a theme that upper register stuff. I mean, this is all upper register stuff. He's having it's more real, all that stuff. We want to drive it down and have it mesh with the real world, and the real world. Oh, I just did it. Mesh with the lower register. We want to have it mesh together, and that's true. Now, so Mark sent me this. It's you got to listen to this, and so I had like 3 or 4 videos to listen to this morning, and so I'm making my way through this. And I've heard plenty of stories like this, not just from people on the internet, but in real life. Very few people quite as hardcore as this guy, but I went and I did this, and I met this guru and this teacher, and I got into meditation, and I got into yoga, and I started eating different, and yada 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 yada. I haven't heard a lot of people say they embrace celibacy as a result of it, so that's why I know this guy is serious. But this story doesn't stop here. This is really a rather remarkable story.
Did you have like a single experience, or did you have several of these experiences that were like that?
Multiple.
Multiple.
It got to the point where, yeah, I mean, I was meditating like 4 hours a day. I would sit in meditation sometimes and be gone, like samadhi, kind of
Yeah.
disappear
Yeah.
and come back, and thought it was 10 minutes or something, and it was 4 hours, this
Yes,
kind of
yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
I was maintaining consciousness sometimes through falling asleep, this lucid
Yeah. The lucid.
thread of awareness that I'd go to sleep, I'd be in these altered states all night, lucid dreaming, kind of out of body astral travel-y, kind of very, like some of those, just to me, I know the terminology of lucid dreaming is when you know that you're dreaming without waking up.
Yep.
That's the standard interpretation. But I would like to have another word, and I don't want to just use the same word because everybody takes that word to mean that. But there have been dreams that are so real and so lucid in the ordinary sense of lucid.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Brilliant, clear, like what's that word? Ontonormative that you use.
Right.
They have such a reality to them that they seem more
The guy's smart. He's able to assimilate these fancy Verveiki words just like that.
real than the waking state. I've
Yes.
had a lot of those, and
Wow.
I call them lucid because I don't know what else to call them. But
No, I
it's
understand.
like lucid 1 and lucid 2. But I've had a lot of
So like God 1 and God 2.
precognitive dreams, like really, like I think I mentioned, multiply precognitive dreams. I've had those kind of transcendent samadhi-like experiences.
Yes.
I have all kinds of weird psychic phenomena,
Yeah.
senses of telepathy, seeing people's energy, almost.
Okay, so if this guy's telling the truth, and there's no reason to believe he isn't, he's, John Verveiki takes him as a credible individual. He's a professor at the City University of New York in Brooklyn. I don't get the sense that he's just a liar out there lying to us. He's had all these experiences. And again, as a pastor, people have experiences and they tell you about them, and they don't tell a lot of people about them, but they will tell a pastor usually because it's all sort of spiritual, and surely a pastor must have had some of his own or have done some of this.
Like psychedelic experiences,
Yes. Yes.
but
Yes.
but when once I started doing this, I stopped taking drugs and all that. I did acid and stuff like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and peyote and all that. In the first, I did do that. Actually, I should say that there was a short period after I got into meditation where I was still doing that stuff.
Right. Right.
But then at a certain point, I just, I flipped and said, "Nah, I got to stop doing that. This is better." What was one of my meditation teachers quoted some Indian guru who said something like, "Drugs are like plastic grapes and God is the wine," or something like that. And like, you hear these phrases and that just something clicks. And I thought, yeah, and then Ram Dass's guru. Ram Dass was one of my teachers, by the way. I studied with him.
Okay, we're going to get into those stories because those stories are also important to the conversation here. But again, it's important to notice that, okay, people have experiences. I mean, I almost feel like I'm reading 2 Corinthians 12, where the Apostle Paul is in this riff about boasting in 2 Corinthians with the Corinthians, because the Corinthian church, they're having all of these, worship of the angels and experiences and all of these things. And the Apostle Paul says, I've had better experiences than all y'all. And what is it? I mean, 1 Corinthians 13, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, if I have these amazing visions, if I have all these things, but I have not love. Okay, well, that's, again, Christianity keeps driving back down into the meeting of heaven and earth. Upper and register cannot be separated. They have to be together, because that's what we are. That's what we're made for heaven and earth to meet and to be together. Okay, let's keep going with where this all goes, because again, I was listening to this and these all the spiritual stuff.
Wow.
Because he was a part of my sangha for a few years in New York City. That group that
I've never read any Ram Dass. I've heard his name a few times, and I remember one time I said, "I'd never heard of the guy," and people were like, "You haven't heard of Ram Dass? Should I have?" Oh yeah, he's big. Oh, so this guy was in the same group as the big guy. And again, Christians play these same games. I mean, status. Human beings, we're into status.
first teacher that I found maybe 6 months. Yeah, 6 months into my going to her weekly meditations, I finally talked my best friend into coming, Barry, real hippie, acid freak kind of guy at the time. I finally talked him into coming after he read, Be Here Now, because I carried that book around like it was my Bible. The first time he came, Hilda wasn't there. Ram Dass was there in her place. He was like, "Oh, Hilda's not feeling well. She asked me to, substitute for her." And Barry was like, "Oh my God, this must be the right place, because we've got Ram Dass." So, but Ram Dass, and after a short period of time of being in the group, there were all these little private group meditations going on, the splinters, that private little sanghas, and in one of the teacher's basement for like the elite followers or whatever.
We love status. We love VIP. We love as C.S. Lewis said, we love the inner ring.
We jokingly called them the God Squad. But I wound up getting right into all that in a short period of time. And I had Hilda, Ram Dass, and another woman named Joya, who was very, very spiritually advanced person. She was like a walking ball of psychic energy, or what do you call it? Shakti or chi, or depending on your tradition. I lost my train of thought. I forgot what question I was answering. Did I have just one? No, it got to the point where 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, I was in an altered mystical kind of state.
Right.
For a few years.
Now, isn't this what some of y'all are seeking? You want to be in that state. You want to be in it all the time, and you want to have the feels, and you want to have the experience, and you want to be in that all the time, and then what? And then world peace will break out, and we'll never have winter, and the climate will stabilize, and what do we want?
And it got so bad. I mean, I was in my late teens at that point. And then what happened, this is this interesting thing, because you'll like this story. Ram Dass had been with the group for a few years, and he had a falling out with the other two teachers, particularly with Joya.
Okay, well, spiritual people aren't supposed to have falling out. Well, lest I not mention one of the great falling outs of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul and Barnabas. So, I'm not pointing fingers here, but again, having these spiritual experiences 24/7 in your early teens. I mean, he's arrived.
Who, according to Ram Dass, wanted to induct him into tantric training.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah. And Ram Dass felt like he was sincere about it, because he's gay, and he thought he's always been uncertain about his sexuality, and he thought maybe this would be good for him, and he tried it, but he thought
he's gonna fix his gayness. In that case, it's not pray the gay away, but do something else to get rid of the gay.
But that she was more human than tantric in the experience. I'm paraphrasing what he wrote about this publicly. Wow. When he left, he wrote an article called "Egg on My Beard" or something, because he felt bad because he brought all of his students to Joya and Hilda. And then he left. When he left, the other two teachers were pointing the finger at each other. And Hilda said, yeah, it's Joya. She's kind of...
Now, there's a reason why churches, at least aspirationally, have rather stringent sexual demands on their people. And it's for reasons like this, because nothing will split a group up faster than a sexual catastrophe.
Like, she got the power too quickly. She's kind of like Darth Vader or something, too much power, not without spiritual evolution enough, her ego is still there. And so they were all pointing fingers, and they separated. And to me, I was with them for a few years. My life had been radically transformed. I mean, I really felt like one of the apostles with Jesus.
Wow.
The kingdom had come.
For years. And then, as if there were three Jesuses, and they got a divorce.
Oh, boy.
It was horrifying. And I didn't know what to do. And I kept wanting to be with all three of them.
Now, when I was on the Discord this afternoon just briefly, and Mark Lefebvre was on there, and Mark said, "Did you watch that video?" And he's like, church. And that's right. No, church isn't mentioned here, but all the deconstructions, all the, all the problems in church, all of Babylon Bee had a hilarious video that did on deconversion. But the way this guy phrased it is just genius.
Ram Dass and Jesus's, and they got adults with Jesus. I mean, I really felt like one of the apostles with Jesus.
Wow.
For years. And then as if there were 3 Jesuses, and they got a divorce.
Oh, boy.
It was horrifying. And I didn't know what to do. And I kept wanting to be with all 3 of them. Ram Dass stopped being a teacher. He would give an occasional lecture in a public forum, and I would go to that. But I kept going to Joya's meetings, her separate little meetings, her Sangha, satsang, we call it back in the Hindu name is satsang, the community of Satya is truth,
And it's always the fascination with the original. So, oh, you learned Greek and Hebrew? Oh, we're gonna talk to Paul Anleitner. We're gonna blow the shofar. We're gonna blow the same instruments that the Hebrews used. And I remember being in one charismatic group, and one woman there said, I got some oil, and it's exactly the same mixture that they used to have in Palestine. And if you go to Paul Kingsnorth's article on this, it's really amazing, because when he got into Wiccan, it was first he got into Wiccan because he wanted a nature religion, and that's what he was really looking for. See if I can find it here in the text. The Rebel Wisdom video is good, but if you really want a sense of his story, the Cross and the Machine is really well told. The short version of the story is that I joined my local Wiccan coven. Wicca is a relatively new occult tradition founded in the 1950s by eccentric English Gerald Gardner. If you remember my episode from The Rest is History on modern pagans, that's what was treated here. Who claimed that he had discovered the ancient remnant of the pre-Christian goddess cult. He was fibbing. But the practice he sewed together out of older disparate parts is largely cohesive, complete with secret initiatory rituals, a law book that can be copied only by hand by initiates, magic spells, spell work, protective circles, and at the heart of it, the worship of 2 deities, the great goddess and the horned god. All initiated Wiccans are priests or priestesses of these gods. There are no laity. That's critical. Now, that's a very interesting aspect in, let's say, in sort of North American appropriation of a lot of these Eastern. Everybody's a yogi. Everyone's a yogi. There's no laity. Everyone's a priest. And, well, Protestantism is the priesthood of all believers, but we still have clergy, don't we? It's interesting how these traditions sort of continue to work on these dynamics. My coven used to do its rituals in the woods under the full moon. It was fun. It made things happen. I discovered that magic is real. It works. It works for another question. At last I was home, where I belonged, in the woods, worshiping a nature goddess under the stars. I even got to wear a cloak. Everything seemed to have fallen into place until I started having dreams. I had known, I suppose, that the abyss was still there inside me, that what I was doing in the woods, though affecting, was also at some level still play acting. Then one night I dreamed of Jesus. The dream was vivid, and when I woke up, I wrote down what I had heard him say. I drew what he had looked like. Remember when I talked about dreams and psychedelics? You have dreams. You don't need any drugs to have dreams. Just get a pencil and paper and write them down. I mean, you're really looking for scrambling experiences? Just write down your dreams and think about them. I mean, people have been doing that forever. Freud did it. Jung did it. The crux of the matter was that he was to be the next step in my spiritual path. I didn't believe that or want it to be true, but the image and the message reminded me of something strange that had happened a few months before. My wife and I were out to dinner celebrating our wedding anniversary when suddenly she said to me, "You're going to become a Christian." Now his wife is not. His wife is. What did he say? I think his wife is his wife a Sikh? He mentioned it in the video. When I asked her what on earth she was talking about, she said she didn't know. She had had a feeling and needed to tell me. My wife has a preternatural sensitivity that she always denies, and wasn't the first time she had done something like this. It shook me. A Christian? Me? What could be weirder?
Truth seekers. So, and I kept going to Hilda's, but then Hilda didn't want me to go because I was one of her close people, and like there was no love lost between them, and they were, well, Hilda was vilifying Joya. Joya was not vilifying anybody. But so I was like that kid who's like, I'm not going to decide between my parents. But then Hilda at one point challenged me and said, look, if you keep going to Joya's, you can't come to the private meetings. You could only come to the open one at the church once a week.
Church discipline.
So I went there a few times, but after a while, I just didn't like that whole scene. And it was a horrific loss of support for me. And even though ideologically and philosophically,
shouldn't all of those experiences and shouldn't all of that have just made him like this ascendant master, and he'd be full of power? And did he really need community? Did he really need people? Did he really need a story to inhabit? Did he really need all of the stuff around him that actually, yeah, he did. Because that's how we are. You never believe anything alone. You really don't. Maybe a few people can manage that, but the vast majority of human beings, we believe in community.
Always revolted against this idea that I read mostly in these, contemplative traditions, that you need a community. Because I had such a bad experience with community, I resisted that narrative whenever I come across it. But on reflection, just recently thinking about it and having a discussion with someone else like you just the other day, I realized that I went through, which I didn't mention yet, I went through a kind of dark night of the soul, really like negative, supernaturalistic, psychic, mystical experiences after I lost the connection with the satsang, with the Sangha.
Sounded very traumatizing.
Yeah. And I was in my late teens, I don't know, 18, something, 19, I forget the exact age, but I had all that. It was like I was completely psychically open, like my chakras were wide open. I was very sensitive, but I had no supports.
Right.
And so all of a sudden I was having all these negative spiritual experiences. And it really felt like I was waiting for myself to have stigmata or something. Like I felt like I was being attacked, because I just didn't have, prior to them splitting up, I was in a Garden of Eden kind of state.
Right.
All the time. I was so in the flow. Everything was so natural and connected. And then it just became very alienated. And I had a lot of weird overnight dreams. I felt like I was battling demons and everything. It just got too freaky for me. And I had some symbolic moments. Like I had this one dream that was lucid, I wasn't awake, but it was actually my lucid dreams are almost both senses of lucid.
Yeah.
In that period, because I would be awake. I would be conscious.
Yeah.
During the dream, and I knew that it was an altered reality. I knew I wasn't in the waking world, so it was lucid. But it was so normal for me that it didn't hit me like, oh, I'm in a lucid dream. It was all the time for me.
Yeah.
But many of them were so lucid. They were lucid in that second sense of more real than real. And in one of them, I was climbing up this tower, this wooden shaft, very high, and I knew that it represented my spiritual ascension. And the higher I went, the thinner it got. It was wood, and it was being blown about by the wind, and it was rickety. And the higher I went, the more dangerous it was. And I was almost at the top, and I knew if I went any further, the whole thing would collapse. And so I just turned around and went back down. And after that dream and a couple of other things like that, I had a whole bunch of these kind of, noetic, omen-like insights that let me know I was playing with something that I was not equipped to play with. I did not have the right skills.
That point, as Sam Harris always says, put a pin in that point right there. He was playing with something that he was 18. I mean, he didn't have the rights. Now, it's interesting because, again, I began this talking about your metaphysical frame, your worldview frame is going to, in a lot of ways, impact your appropriation of this, your understanding of this. I mean, Verveiki made the comment in the Four Horsemen's video about, do you have the wisdom? And an 18-year-old doesn't have much wisdom at all because they're only 18. They're just beginning their life. So he gets to this point.
I didn't have the right development. So I decided, I had a bunch of clues like on what I could do. And I remember, what's his name? Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna, Vivekananda's teacher in the 1800s. I don't know if the Vedantist.
Yep.
I remember reading that he smoked cigars or cigarettes or pipes or whatever to keep him in his body.
Right.
That was one clue. And
now we say if you smoke too many of those secrets, that'll take you out of your body.
Somebody else, some Buddhist, shaman guy told his student that you need to eat meat or something because, you're too imbalanced or whatever. And, so there was a bunch of these clues, and I just decided, I did this intense sadhana, spiritual work that brought all this on, opened me up. I've got to do like a reverse sadhana.
Right.
To shut it down. And that's what I did. So I started smoking, and everything I gave up, I brought back. So then there was another period of my life where I started doing everything again.
Right.
And that was fun. It was like being born again in the flesh rather than born again in the
That's just a hilarious line.
spirit. It was like going from a black and white world into a colorful world. Like I had ignored what in the two worlds ontology, I was not in the lower world for years. So
He was not in the lower register. Right there.
it was happy to come back to that world. And then I kept all I kept was my yoga practice, my mantras, 2 mantras that I've been doing. One is like the Jesus prayer or from the church fathers, Kyrie eleison, and Om Mani Padme Hum, the Tibetan daily mantra. Ram Dass had taught me that, like he initiated me in that and gave me a mala and all this kind of stuff, and put me into samadhi. I had a phenomenal experience, just me and Ram Dass once. But I kept what I thought would sustain me because I knew I needed to keep my spiritual practice. But what would shut down the chakras and all that, whatever all that other stuff was, I just tried to avoid anything that would like certain kinds of pranayama practices, like chi cultivating practice. I eliminated all of that. I just kept a simple mantra, which I could do throughout the day, while I'm jogging or whatever, doing anything, and my mindfulness thing, which guess who taught me that? He was a member of that same group, Danny Goldman.
Oh, wow. You've known a lot of the stars, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, Danny's name back then was Jagannath Das. He was one of, him and Ram Dass had the same guru, the little old man in India, Maharaji, named Crowley Baba.
Oh.
So Danny was in our satsang back then, and he taught me mindfulness. So I thought, yeah, that's kind of clean and simple. And there are places where you could go, like insight meditation, whatever, where it's just, there's no guru thing involved. I was averse to gurus.
I can see why.
And,
I can see
anything.
why.
I mean, he had deconstructed from his New Age church after he had a bad experience about it and all of that. Here's the video from the Babylon Bee. I abandoned my faith like that. I mean, it's just a hilarious satirical video. But part of I think why Mark sent me to that video is it's like this is. I mean, it's like the evangelical deconstruction story, just with yoga and Ram Dass and yoga and all of these things. But now I want to go back and do more with Karen and Gavin. Now, part of the reason I do with Gavin is because, for a lot of you, I've just made you really annoyed or nervous because you really don't like the kinds of stories that this guy was telling. And it sort of sounds like least common denominator spirituality and Christianity and yoga and the Hindu stuff and the Buddhist stuff. It's all the same. And I mean, all that stuff, all that, some might call syncretism. And if you know anything about Gavin Ashenden and his story, The dude is not down with syncretism at all. And when you listen to his sort of takes on the conversations that Jordan Peterson has had in Cambridge, well, very interesting. So let's pick his story back up.
Someone I was very close to was very close to suicide, and I felt responsible, and had no idea what to do about it. I had never met manic depression, and I remember thinking, well, what on earth happened the last time I hit a wall and crashed? Oh, for goodness sake, God! Why on earth have I forgotten about God? I better go and find him. And then, for some reason, I decided I had better work my way through the sort of 5 major world religions in order to discover which one most looked like this experience of light, judgment, intimacy. I thought, well, I'll start with Buddhism because that would be cool. It would be cool to be a Buddhist, and if it turns out that Buddha and this experience, that would give me a certain amount of street credibility. But in fact, I became a Christian because there was a university mission to my university town, and I went to hear the person speak, and I became provisionally converted. I thought, this Jesus sounds like what happened to me. But I was terrified of Billy Graham. It's hard to overestimate how anxious English people were about American emotional religion. It just
Oh, gotta loosen up a little bit.
Threatened us in an area where we felt profoundly incompetent. And so I thought, what if this man is like Billy Graham and I've been brainwashed, as if that's how spiritual experience happens, as if that's how brainwashing happens. It's very odd. But I think probably looking back, I would now put this down to demonic interference, but that's another conversation too. So there were these strange and ridiculous, irrational thoughts in my head. But I became a Christian for periods of 48 hours to be reviewed, and I reviewed them and went on reviewing them and went on being a Christian. And then I was training to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a Christian lawyer. I thought society needed Christian lawyers. But then this whole business of how you mend people and how you mend society began to crystallize in my head a bit more, and I found myself being drawn reluctantly, because I didn't like the image of clergy very much. I didn't really like the church very much.
Now again, boy, you folks in the UK, you guys have done a number on yourselves. I loved the description of clergy in see if I should. It's not great video to watch me scroll. So Paul Kingsnorth, when he's a kid, sneaks into empty churches and a visit was less serious. A 15-year-old boy with his schoolmates can't be admitted to interest in rude lofts. I'd like to say it's something else to write in the visitor's book, where other people had inscribed things like, "What a beautiful building, and I feel a tremendous sense of peace here. But a man should never lie about matters of the soul." So I just took off the B-row and scrawled, "I will destroy you and all your works, ha ha ha," then signed it Satan. A few days later, we came back and did it again. "Die, Nazarene, victory is mine." I think we'd been watching the Omen films. Part of what Kingsnorth gets very right in this piece is his description of Christianity. The story of Christianity, wrote Moriarty, is the story of humanity's rebellion against God. There's a good summary. I'd never thought of that ancient, tired religion in this way before. Never had reason to, but as I did now, I feel something happened, some inner shift, some coming together of previous scattered parts designed to fit, though I'd never known it, into a quiet, unbreakable whole. Back then, there were 2 distinct flavors of Christianity, both of which I tried to avoid. One was the fusty old Church of England variety. You could see this if you were going to a wedding or a funeral, or when a vicar was invited to give a sermon at school. The vicar would be a slightly Victorian figure, an older man, almost dainty in his manners, trying his best to speak in a dying tongue to a generation of kids whose interests were ZX spectrums. The Victorian vicar would hand out morality lessons from a man who had lived 2,000 years ago and whose core imaginary might as well have been from Mars: wine presses, fishing boats, vineyards, masters and servants, virgins. The basic pitch seemed best summed up by Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I'd rather have read than listen to the vicar. One man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change. The second flavor was the trendy vicar. Unlike his predecessor, the trendy vicar was plugged into the spirit of the age. He knew and insisted on He knew that instead of bicycling to Holy Communion through the morning mist, we were watching the young ones or playing Manic Minor, and he was on our side. The trendy vicar that'd be the youth pastor in America. The trendy vicar had a clipped beard and wore jeans and sang folk songs about Jesus and was our friend, and gave awkward vernacular sermons in which biblical stories were interspersed with references to EastEnders or Dallas or Michael Jackson songs. Despite his good intentions, the trendy vicar was much worse than the stuffy victor. At least the Victorian sermons were in some way otherworldly, as religion would be. If it was pop culture we wanted, we did, and we were better off sticking with the real thing, which was to say the thing without any Jesus in it. That's so true of so much American religion, and basically the boomer seeker culture and then the emergent movement from the seeker, which split into young, restless, and reformed, progressive evangelicals, now increasingly ex-evangelicals, and then the neo-sacramentalists.
Actually, to becoming a priest. So I became a priest, and then after working as an Anglican priest for 10 years, I thought I really need to know much more about how human beings work. It's absolutely fine understanding the Bible and the soul and the various permutations of spirituality, but there's a great overlap between the soul and the rationality and the psychological insights into why we do what we do and how we account for ourselves. So I found myself doing some postgraduate psychology, and then ended up at a university where, having got a PhD as well, I lectured in literature and psychology, and then did a bit of philosophy teaching as well as running an interfaith chaplaincy. So I also lectured in Islam and Judaism, in metaphysical monism, as we called it, and spent 20 years there. During that 20 years, I became a Jungian, mainly because I found that the task of trying to interpret the overlap between human mental distress and the existence of evil too difficult. I ran away from it. And the person who opened the door to a wonderful place to run away and find a different narrative, a much less stressful and attractive narrative, was Carl Gustav Jung. But there's another reason for it, and that was in this period, I was at probably the most secular and progressive university in the UK. And Freud had a very powerful influence. I mean, even though post-Freud and post-post-Freud and post-post-post-Freud, nonetheless, his fingerprints were all over my atheist colleagues. And one of the things that Jung did in those days was to provide which would allow the reintroduction of spirituality, religion, metaphysics, a kind of spiritually interested philosophy back onto the table. It had been cast right off the table. And although you had to fight to get it back on the platform from which I could begin to have conversations with atheists I wanted to convert to Christianity.
So our connection is a little bit unstable right now, but I think I heard you say that Jung gave you a platform with which you could speak to some of your atheist colleagues. It's sort of, Jung was an antidote to Freud.
Yes, I mean, I'll repeat myself, and presumably you can edit it in if I've.
She doesn't edit, just like I don't.
So Jung wasn't an antidote to Freud so much as a complementary alternative. Freud was so reductionist and so aggressive that he really required you to buy into him totally as a worldview. And Jung's difficulty with Freud was to be hugely impressed with what Freud had done psychoanalytically, but to say, look, your blind spot, indeed your hatred of your own father, who is Yahweh as a Jew, your father issues have blinded you to the possibility of God and atheism. And this was not entirely true. The difficulty was that the God that Jung posited was in fact the self. One has to define one's terms. Sort of the ego, though the ego is a Freudian word. And so Jung looked like he was doing Christianity. Well, if it was useful to you, you could say he was doing Christianity, and if it was not useful to you, you could say he was doing psychology. You could play it both ways. He was a kind of sub-Christian Gnostic. But for me in particular, what he did was to, particularly with the use of the notion of the shadow, was to allow me to bypass any further questions I had about the objectivity of evil, because Jung's notions of shadow are really quite warm and compelling and easy, and move you right away from having to make decisions about the reality of evil. In a way, this required a certain amount of, if not schizophrenia, but compartmentalization in my brain, because one of the things that had a great effect on me growing up was the discovery of Auschwitz. And I remember thinking...
Now, if you look at his video that he just made, a lot of these same things come up. Now, I'm running out of time, so maybe I'll weave all these things in to a video that I make tomorrow. So, again, I can't stress enough your participation. I know I don't always get to read every question, and I don't. Part of the reason sometimes I put the little hearts by the questions just to show myself and to show you that I've read your question. And just because I didn't heart it didn't mean I didn't read your question, but I do read the comments, and your comments weave in here in terms of my whole process. And so your comments are really important, and that's especially true with the Rough Draft for Sunday comments. I post those before I preach so that I can actually sometimes take in your comments, and the same with the Sunday school class, take in your comments and weave that into my process. It doesn't mean that I'll do what you say. But anyway, part of the reason I'm getting at this is that, Ashtondon, this guy has now become a culture warrior. He used to be vicar to the Queen. He had a radio program for the BBC. He left the Anglican Church to become Roman Catholic. It's so important that none of these mystical stories lead any of us to imagine fairly clean, simple narratives with respect to, these things always lead people here. They really don't. The variety is astounding, which goes back to my point that this stuff is far less rare than many people think. The reason people think it's rare is because nobody talks about it. Not in our culture, at least.
Auschwitz was a very good reason for believing in God. That's not, of course, how the Jews experienced it at the time, for obvious reasons. But my thinking was, I cannot conceive that the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of Goethe and Beethoven and Mozart and Schiller could dream up the concentration camps. There has to be something extra, something diabolically extra, through which human beings become sort of an instrumentation of their own destruction, moral and physical. And that's evil.
That's so interesting, because when I was in college, I'm old, so I was in college back in the late 60s. And during that time, they actually would show us videos about the concentration camps, and we talked about it. They don't do that anymore in college, I'm sure, but or they may, but they don't talk about it in the same way. And what you just said about there had to be something diabolically more, I think that's exactly the problem with our culture today, is that I was a missionary for a number of years and did a lot of missionary training. And during that time, they talk to us a lot about how in other countries, if you go to South America, you go to Africa, you go to certain places, people are very aware of spiritual reality. They are very aware that there is a demonic reality and that there is a reality that's on the other side. And the only reason that we don't see it in this country is we are so sophisticated. We are, we've pasted over this sophisticated view of ourselves that we just block out anything that shows that demonic reality.
I think I just want to say that
I was going to say that is exactly why a number of years ago I had this idea that the way to prove the existence of God is to really look at evil, because sin and evil are what actually show us that God has to be real.
Now, it's very interesting if you go back and look at the clips I played in the Hole in the World That's Left by the Church video, where I played some clips from the Cambridge Union. I mean, Peterson basically makes the same argument that Karen just made right here.
And it's a very complicated...
And Verveiki in some ways makes a similar argument when he talks about addiction as reciprocal narrowing. So then there must be reciprocal broadening.
It's not a 30-second evangelistic message, but it's deeply true.
I don't want to go down this road now, but the problem with our obsession with racism at the moment is it's keeping us from a knowledge of God. Why? Because racism is a sin, obviously, but it's only one sin. And the idea that you can sum up all sin in a sort of in attributing a bad attitude from one human being to another is so under-ambitious, because this bad attitude of one person to another based on skin color, if that's what it is only a small part of the appalling bad attitude that human beings have to all other human beings. In other words, it's too modest to link it only to race. And if you do that, you then take your eye off the whole of the rest of the problem of the human condition. And I mean, without wanting to lose the thread, what stopped me from being a Jungian was that in 2008, I had a couple of demonic attacks. And I was so surprised by this and so terrified by them. I still don't know exactly why they happened, but I remember getting in touch with a Catholic exorcist priest I knew and said, I'm either having a very serious nervous breakdown or else there are demons and they're attacking me. Tell me what is this? And he said, no, I don't think you're having a breakdown. This is demonic. And so I said, well, what on earth do I do? And then that led to another conversation. But one of the things it meant was I could no longer be a Jungian because I mean, Jung is problematic anyway, partly because he began his psychological work with a foray into the occult. It started with a séance being conducted by his cousin. So right from the very beginning, he had opened the doors that traditional Christians know you should not open unless you expect trouble. And one of the problems we have with Jung is he's so very, very good in many ways. He gives us also maps of meaning and maps into the psyche, but he's so very, very bad in that, rather like racism, he deflects us. The concept of racism, he deflects us from dealing with things that we ought to take very seriously and fail to take seriously. So the ego the self replaces God, and the shadow and the invitation to a kind of integrative reconciliation within oneself stops us asking any of the questions about evil and sin. And that's just an inadequate way of looking at life.
Okay, so I'm going to have to stop this here just because I'm out of time for today. Let's see. What do I want to note before I go? Because this is really only half the video I wanted to make. I just didn't have the time today. And so, okay, I'll make the rest tomorrow. I don't know if I'll have two titles or how I'll be able to sort of get the title straight, but there it is. Leave me a comment about what you heard, and hopefully I can regain this thread tomorrow and continue this video, which will be posted the day after.